Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could join us today. My name is Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy, and it is my pleasure to introduce these two wonderful people up here in the front of the room. First is my friend and colleague, Rashad Shabazz, who is an interdisciplinary historian, geographer, urbanist, and professor of African and African American Studies here at Arizona State University. We're here today to discuss Professor Shabazz's forthcoming book, Biography of a Sound: Prince, Place, and the History of the Minneapolis Sound. It is also my pleasure to introduce Jeanelle Austin. Ms. Austin is the executive director of the George Floyd Global Memorial and a community activist in George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. She's also the creator of the Twin Flames exhibit, after which the speaker series is named, and which is currently on display upstairs. Twin Flames is an exhibit of protest signs and memorial offerings from George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, a 4-square block area that was a barricaded, cop-free zone for over a year after Floyd's murder on May 25th, 2020, and continues to be a site of abolitionist protest, as well as protests and abolition. And the exhibit is also has on display signs and offerings that are from protest and abolitionist organizations here in Maricopa County. The exhibit is the product of a collaboration between the Center for Work and Democracy, which has been working with the community in George Floyd Square since the uprising, the Arizona State University Art Museum, where we currently are, and the George Floyd Global Memorial, which has been preserving the story of the community at 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis since the uprising. The talks in the Twin Flames series are here and at this time, so that people will have the opportunity to visit the exhibit before or after the talk. The exhibit will be here until July 28th, so if you have not seen it, please visit. The Twin Flames Speaker Series highlights scholars who are doing work that is in dialogue with the activists and community leaders in George Floyd Square. Our first speaker, H.L.T. Kwan, recently published the book Becoming Ungovernable: An Abolitionist Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living, which is a powerful argument for the sort of social transformation imagined by many of the activists in Minneapolis. Diva Woodley's work elevates the work of activists like those in George Floyd Square as necessary for democratic functioning and renewal. Finally, today, Rashad Shabazz is joined by the executive director of the George Floyd Global Memorial, Jeanelle Austin, to discuss his new book, which surfaces a hidden history of an urban music scene, but one that is not entirely hidden to the people around George Floyd Square and on the south side of Minneapolis. A lot of the stories that Rashad is going to tell in his book are stories that are well known to people who live in that neighborhood. So with all these preliminaries aside, please join me in welcoming Rashad Shabazz and Jeanelle Austin to talk about Rashad's new book.
Are you going to start?
Hello.
It's going to the web.
Oh.
Yes. So
They
can
just
hear
okay.
us.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful to see you all here. My students are in the house, so my race geography students are here. So some of them will be scurrying out in a little bit, but I'm glad you all could come. I want to thank Jeanelle for being here so much. I want to thank Michael for organizing and for the wonderful introduction. I want to thank Mickey for the space, the support, Brittany, the whole crew, Mia, Maria, Muriel, Maria, everybody in the museum. There's board members here, Olga, other folks, colleagues, HQ. So thanks everybody for being here and allowing us to eat up a little bit of your Thursday afternoon on a really nice sunny April day. So I'm going to talk about my forthcoming book, and Jeanelle and I are going to have a dialogue. So let me say a little bit about why I'm doing this. I'm doing it for two reasons. One, I wanted to be part of this. I wanted to be part of the Twin Flame Speaker Series. I wanted to have the opportunity to share this work with people that I really care about and respect and really be a part of this moment. The second reason I'm doing it is because I don't know if I'm gonna be here next year. And there's a chance, coming up in the next few weeks where I have to make a decision whether I'm gonna be here or I'm gonna be somewhere else. And I didn't wanna come back here as a faculty member somewhere else. I wanted to talk about this work that I did while I was here, that I wrote while I was here, that I spoke to people about over the years while I've been here. So, you know, it's kind of bittersweet. You know, this might be my like last hurrah, and if it is, you know, I'm gonna shed some tears, but I'm gonna also say thank you to all the people who've been really supportive. And if it's not, it's great, because that means, you know, my home institution gets what my home institution deserves, which is a sneak preview of the book that's coming out in the fall. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for providing this space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to give a little bit of a genealogy of how it emerged, why I wrote it, what it does, and then we're going to do our thing. So I'm going to try to keep this part to about like 20 minutes or so, because I want to talk with you know, this fantastic Southsider here. I want to talk to y'all. So what I'm gonna do actually is I'm gonna read a little bit. Y'all mind if I read a little bit? Is that good? All right, cool. Oh, and I was trying to get this thing to work, and it says it's playing, or maybe I'm hooked up to somebody else's device, which is not cute at all. No, it's not. It's not. Right now, I mean, this is like.
Watch, I'm the one connected.
Okay, so it's doing that, and then it is. This is the JBL.
Is it the Flip 5?
JBL Flip 5?
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
There we go.
There we go. There we go. All right. Yeah, yeah. So I'm just gonna let this run, because you know, don't have to be beautiful. All right. So I'm gonna read like a couple of pages from the introduction and sort of say a little bit about the book. But the introduction is called "This is not the kind of music that comes from Minneapolis." On January 26, 1980, January 26, 1980 was a monumental day in Prince's career. On that day, 19-year-old Prince and his mixed-race, mixed-gender band were in Los Angeles performing on the iconic music program American Bandstand. Prince lip-sank "I Want to Be Your Lover" off his sophomore album, Prince. The young composer who'd signed with a major recording studio 2 years earlier was on the most watched music program in the country. Millions were tuning in. Nailing the performance greased the wheels of stardom. Falling flat made the journey that much harder. As Prince and his band mimicked playing the song's final notes, thunderous applause erupted from the teenage crowd, and a star was born. For many fans and critics, this performance is one of his most important because it set him on the path to stardom. The skyrocketing of his career and the sound associated with him was, in a sense, cemented in that January performance. For me, the performance remains pivotal, not for its pop cultural significance, but for what it reveals about Prince and his hometown, and by extension, about the geography of music. Clark thought Prince was great, but he had a hard time reconciling Prince's sound with Minneapolis. Indeed, "I Want to Be Your Lover's" sonic marriage of funk and disco with bright, taut guitar riffs, pulsating synthesizer chords, falsetto vocals over subtle funky bass, and an electric drum machine pattern done by Prince surprised Clark. After the performance, the astonished Southern California host interviewed the shy Minneapolitan. "Clark, where'd you learn to do this in Minneapolis?" Prince, "Where?" Clark, "Yeah, this is not the kind of music that comes from Minneapolis, Minnesota." Prince, "No." The painfully awkward interview full of one-word answers from Prince illustrates this point precisely. Clark couldn't understand how Prince could make such music from Minneapolis. Something in the vein of Bob Dylan, folksy, bluesy tunes, made more sense to him than the funky disco pop Prince performed. The exchange between Prince and Clark reveals nothing musical happens in a placeless vacuum. However, it may sometimes seem that way for listeners used to endlessly shareable recordings. The place isn't just the background for making or transmuting music. On the contrary, place and space are formative to the sounding and resounding of music. And of course, physical locations don't exist in a vacuum either. They are shaped by the sound as much as by social forces like racism and poverty shape them. This book is a geographic look at the music Prince made famous, the Minneapolis Sound. If you've never heard of the term Minneapolis Sound before, it describes Prince's specific sound. You know it when you listen to songs like 1999, If I Was Your Girlfriend, Raspberry Beret, or the song that's playing right now. Like, couldn't make that up, couldn't make that up. Its distinct signature is its unique fusion of rock, R&B, synth pop, punk, and new wave into a pop music format. This is achieved through tight guitar riffs, understated bass lines, drum machines, synthesizers instead of horns, and high-pitched falsetto vocals. But the Minneapolis Sound is more than a description of Prince's music or the musical ecosystem he created. Minneapolis Sound is also a way of talking about history, music, and place. It's a way of talking about how this iconic music that filled parties and lubricated good times has a hidden history of violently forcing indigenous people off the land to create a mill town. Minneapolis Sound was the soundtrack of white settlement, the mass migration of Scandinavian, German, Jewish, Black, and white Northeasterners, and the musical high cultural bona fides they enabled. Minneapolis Sound is the 20th century school-based music training that forged unusually high levels of music literacy. It's the racially segregated place where Black musicians flourished, and the post-industrial city where an influential punk and indie rock music scene emerged in the late 1970s and 80s. The Minneapolis Sound is all of these things because these things shaped and informed it. And if we understand its hidden history, we can hear these influences in Prince's music. The sounds are not lyrical, but sonic. They are rooted in chord progressions, instrumentations, tempo, harmony, and rhythm. They are heard in vocal arrangement and the overall fusion of his compositions. This book uncovers that hidden history. Biography of a Sound demonstrates how music shaped the creation of Minneapolis and how Minneapolis shaped music. It reveals how Prince came to play his unique mix of music and investigates how it emerged in the racially vanilla former flower capital of the world. It describes how Minneapolis' soundscape, born of land theft and violence, raised on mass migration, music education, and racial segregation, and evolved through the sonic innovations on the Black and white sides of the color line emerged. It details how a young Black gifted musician from the city's near north side, whose talents were cultivated in that same sonic milieu, minded to create the Minneapolis Sound, and how doing so made him a superstar and the city's sound the zeitgeist of popular music. So thank you. This book started in the fall of 2014 at the University of Vermont. And I was teaching a course called Black Cultural Geographies or something like that. And the course really focused around an article that I had been working on, which was about hip hop and the blues and music and geography. I was really trying to make these connections and think about geography and think about music not only in terms of its sonic abilities, but also think about the relationship between the places from from which it emerges, and those sonic abilities, as well as the politics that underwrite it. So much of the class actually focused on the blues and jazz and funk. And 1 week, we spent 1 week talking about Minneapolis and Prince. And you know, I think the students either like didn't understand why I was talking about it or really didn't care, which, you know, that's just the case with teaching. But it stuck. It really stuck for me. And what I was, you know, I was fascinated by Prince. I always found him interesting, and so much was being written about Prince in terms of his aesthetic, you know, what he looked like, the fact that, you know, this, you know, slight, beautiful black man could wear eyeliner and high heels, you know, better and look better than, you know, any woman in the room. And there was that sort of transgressive, fluid gender performance of Prince that is something that really stood out to me. But I also loved his music. I loved his sound. And having had a relationship with Minnesota and Minneapolis, for me, it started to make sense over time that someone like Prince would come from there. Now, you know, this is 2010, this is 2011, 2013, 2014, 15. No one was thinking about Minneapolis. Nobody cared about Minneapolis because George Floyd had yet to be murdered. When that happened, that shifted the world's focus. But at this time, I was really interested in knowing more about Minneapolis. So I was going up for tenure, and my first book was coming out, and when you go up for tenure, they're also equally as interested in what's the next thing. You know, they want to make sure you're not going to be a one-hit wonder. So I said, well, I'm going to write this book on Minneapolis music and Prince. And in the fall of 2014, my colleague, Sherry Dunkley, gave me one of her classes toward the end of the semester to present something. So I scurried and cobbled some things together and started this project in that moment. And I came to ASU the following fall and began doing this research in the fall, a little bit in the fall of 2015, and did my first site visit to Minneapolis in the summer of 2016. And from the summer of 2016 until the summer of 2019, before COVID hit, I was there every summer doing archival research. Most of my archival research was done at these two locations, the primary branch of the Minneapolis Public Library in the research room on the 3rd floor, and in the State Archive, which is the Minnesota Historical Society or Minnesota History Museum in St. Paul. And I excavated. I just pulled everything I could for years. And this project really started out as me wanting to focus on Prince. And I wanted to focus on Prince not only because I loved his music so much, and I loved him, but I wanted to move away from my first project. I didn't want to do Spatializing Blackness Part 2. I was adamant about that. And I also didn't want to deal with that emotional load. That was a lot emotionally writing that first book. It was my hometown. I was writing about people I knew. I was writing about experiences that I had had. And I didn't necessarily want to do that kind of project again. I wanted to do something that in my mind seemed a bit lighter. I mean, it seems foolish now, but I wanted to do something that seemed a bit emotionally lighter. And as I began to do the research, it became clear that this thing I was doing was not about Prince. It was clear that I was writing about this city, and I was writing about the city's sound. So the way I like to describe the book is that let me say this one other thing. The title is a riff from David Levering Lewis's brilliant 2-volume biography of W.E.B. Du Bois called Biography of a Race. And what he does in that is he looks at W.E.B. Du Bois' race in the United States and blackness through the life of Du Bois, who was born in 1868 and who was born in 1869 and died on the day of the March on Washington, nearly a century. And it's just a brilliant telling of the United States through this period. And what I wanted to do was I was like, okay, I'm gonna borrow that, and I'm gonna borrow this title. But I couldn't figure out the thing that I was tracing. And it just dawned on me that, well, really, what I'm tracing is sound. And there's something profoundly immaterial and abstract about tracing sound, right? How do you capture it? Where is it located? It's ubiquitous. It doesn't just exist in one place. And what kind of sound? But also, sound is profoundly material. Sound emanates out of bodies. It emanates out of material instruments. It always happens in a place that tries to amplify it or to put it on display in a particular way. So what I decided to do was to sort of, borrow from David Levering Lewis's idea of tracing race and racism in the United States through the life of W.E.B. Du Bois in this work. And I also borrowed from this music historian who's at Duke University, whose name is Thomas Brothers, and he's a scholar of Louis Armstrong. He's written 5 books on Louis Armstrong. And my favorite book of his is called Louis Armstrong's New Orleans. And it traces New Orleans from Louis Armstrong's birth until he leaves for Chicago in 1924 or 5, early 20s. And he does something similar that David Levering Lewis does. So I was like, okay, I got this model. I'm gonna rock with this. But again, it was this sort of thing that I'm tracing. And once I figured out what I was tracing, the title emerged, Biography of a Sound. And the book really is a biography of sound. It attempts to capture, trace the physical emergence, the political and economic and racial emergence of Minneapolis' sound from its settler colonial moments up until the release of Prince's magnum opus, Sign of the Times, in my opinion, the greatest double album ever created in 1987. And in doing that, what I'm trying to understand is how the sound emerged, what were the conditions of its emergence? How did it make itself material in people's lives? How did it physically root itself? How did it augment over time? What were the things that allowed for its augmentation? How did it transform the city's political realities? How did it highlight the city's stark racial forms of inequality? And how does that create the context for this brilliant musical kid from the city's north side that, to speak to some of my students, that part of the city that had been abandoned and thrown away. It had been thrown away, partitioned off, effectively left as a kind of dead part of the city along with the south side, right? How did young people from these two sides of the city use the city's musical geography that was really not created for them to craft a sonic force that has been one of the most powerful forms of musical organization in the latter part of the 20th century. So powerful that it has really become the bedrock foundation for modern popular music. And what I mean by that is the ability to synthesize multiple forms of Western popular music through harmonic structures, instrumentation, chord progressions, right? And to do it in such a way to make it both funky, catchy, and extremely adaptive. Right, this is something that I love about Prince's version of the Minneapolis Sound. it is one of the most flexible, adaptive, and open forms of Western popular music. He could do anything in it. Its capaciousness really had no bounds. And that capaciousness allowed him to do funk, blues, orchestral, rock, R&B, synth pop, and just a ton of other musical forms. And there was something about the flexibility of that being born in and through forms of autocratic segregation and apartheid, right? And this is both the aha moment and the irony, right? You know, that this sound emerged from a kind of, you know, the city's necropolis, the dead parts of the cities. This is the parts that were abandoned of resources, the parts that were effectively, you know, left for dead, and that out of that, they're able to synthesize all of these sounds that are happening in the city and create this incredibly flexible, capacious, rich musical tradition that really, you know, is now the form of music that everybody's now trying to play. And it said something to me about Minneapolis, right? Because, you know, what the biographies say about Prince is, oh, he was a purple Martian sent down and he landed in Minneapolis, right? Which is really a disrespect to the people of Minneapolis in general, and a disrespect to the city's black community that had birthed him and raised him, right? It's really a disrespect. But the way it's told is that, oh, he was a purple Martian who came down and gave us purple rain. You know, that his genius and hard work, it was all about that, right? He just sort of sat idly in his studio. No, Prince's sonic force was produced through apartheid, and his ability and his desire to create forms of linkages, to build bridges where walls existed, to create pathways where roadblocks existed. And, you know, while he might not have done it, you know, holding a protest sign, although he supported those people who held those protest signs, he did it in this sonic, because that was his laboratory. That was where he did his work. So Biography of a Sound is you know, my attempt to capture the city's sonic history, to provide a kind of updated history of the city, and to center the parts of the city that have been thrown away and cast off, its south side and its north side, and to also show how the city's favorite son came from that place. And he would not have done what he did. He would not have lubricated our good times. He would not have made our bedroom nights, you know, any better. You know, he would not have had the kind of impact on us that tore us apart when he died 8 years ago this month. That would not have happened without Minneapolis. It would not have happened without Minneapolis. If he came from Detroit, he would have sounded different. If he came from Chicago, he would have sounded different. It was the politics and the geography of those people in that place, in that city, that gave him what he gave to the world. And this book is my attempt to demonstrate that. So luckily I have with me one of the city's finest, who is going to do what she do and, you know, be her amazing self. So yeah, that's my piece.
Thank you. Well, I should begin just by sharing a little bit of my context and relation to Prince, in that he is 3 years younger than my mother. So we're two different generations completely. And growing up, so I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. Growing up, I knew where Prince lived because I was shipped out to private school in Chaska, and to get to Chaska, you had to go through Chanhassen. And Chanhassen is where he built his studio called Paisley Park. Shout out to Paisley Park. This hat is from there, so if you want one, come to Minneapolis. You can get your own hat. I appreciated reading your book because I think it gave me even context for my experience of the sound of Minneapolis and even my own education and how that was formed, and sonically formed, right? I never understood why I have appreciation for classical music until I'm like reading your book and I'm like, oh, that was intentional. That was by design. So Prince. So I didn't really know much about Prince growing up. I grew up in a very religiously conservative church that like we could not listen to secular music at all, right? So Prince was like out of the question, and especially his first couple of albums. So this opportunity allowed me to like study and learn Prince for the first time. Now, before I started deep diving into Prince, the video or the documentary, The Greatest Night in Pop, like dropped, right? And so me and my mom are watching it, and so then my mom starts doing this deep dive on Michael Jackson, and I join her, and we do this like 2-week intensive. And so we're learning about Prince through the lens of Michael Jackson, and I'm feeling some type of way about Prince. I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. And so then I start this deep dive into Prince, to be fair, listening to his music, reading your book, reading his autobiography, and just kind of understanding who he is as a person. And I learned something about my city. One, I learned that he's not just a Southsider. Like, Southside claims him through and through. Like that. Like, I always thought Prince was from Southside, because if you come to South Minneapolis, people be like, oh yeah, Prince is from here. I went to school with Prince. Me and Prince, woo, woo, woo. Like, and I always thought Prince was from Southside. I'm reading his book. He's like, and I'm reading your book. And he's like, no, like, I'm Northside and Southside. Like, I was raised in North, went to school in South, and then moved South. And he kind of like moved between spaces. Now that is extremely significant because geographically in Minneapolis, they put black folks over North, and then they put black folks in a segment of the South. So you had racial covenants and dividing lines where black folks can only buy property in a certain part of South Minneapolis. Southwest Minneapolis is where the very wealthy lived, right? The legacy of your Pillsbury family, the legacy of like all the mill workers. They have these gigantic mansions on these lakes. And then on the kind of like the southeast side of Minneapolis, where you get the Mississippi River. So now you have the houses on the bluffs, and then you move further south, and that's where you get Fort Snelling. That has so much narrative and story and history there. But there's this kind of like this property in the middle of Southside that's not connected to any water. And that's where they kind of agreed that like middle class black folks could be put. And so Southside is really where you get black folks who are trying to, they're entrepreneurs, they're making something of themselves, they're building their businesses, and it becomes this kind of like thriving black community until the 35 highway comes through. And Rashad talks about all of this in his book, so y'all need to read the book. Northside is where more poor black folks were being put. So a lot of Jews had migrated there first, and then they started putting black folks there, and then the Jews who could get out were leaving, and once they made enough wealth, they're then moving into Southwest Minneapolis. And so literally, no joke, like 3 years ago, somebody came up to me. I was in George Floyd Square, and he's not from here, he's from Chicago. And he had expressed to me his perception of the difference between Northside and Southside. And he was like, it's the difference between the Negroes and the nerds. right? So this idea that like Northsiders are hood and Southsiders were bougie, he's not wrong. He's not wrong, because even Prince talks about this in his autobiography. He was like, if I had stayed on the north side, he was like, there was gun violence, people were getting pregnant early, there was just like a lot of noise, and he needed a space to be creative and think. And so by him coming over south and studying over south, it was more peaceful, more quiet, and he could think, right? And so just even thinking about like the geography of Black Minneapolis and where we are, and how he leaned into the different parts of us for the things that he needed, right? And then like downtown is kind of like where we meet for the outings and the music and the nightlife, if you will. And so I feel like reading more about Prince was helping me discover even more about who I am as a Southsider from Minneapolis, and just and more from your book about like just the history of the South, from the waterfalls to the colonization, to the music scene of the classical music and the music that was being that came with migrants from Europe, and how it was just being installed into the education system. I mean, like, I don't know what kind of music education y'all had, but I had like quarter, half note, great big whole note. Like,
so this is huge. This is huge, right? You know, so chapter 3 of the book, I stumbled across this music teacher named Giddings, and I started doing this research on Giddings. So to make it even more bizarre, I don't know if I told you this, so my children are a descendant of Giddings. Giddings is considered the father of modern music education. He created the most sophisticated and robust public school music system in American history. He taught, Minneapolis students music theory. 50,000 children from first grade all the way up to high school are learning music theory. It was part of their daily education. It was not, you didn't have an option. It was math, English, gym, music. You had to take it. And so you learned quarter note, half note. And one of the things that did was it gave young people in Minneapolis tremendous musical fluency. Fifth graders, there was a competition. Giddings also created music camp. So if anybody in this room has ever been to music camp, there's always like one person in the room who's been to music camp. He created band camp. That's what it's called. But he created band camp. So there was a competition where he took 5th or 6th graders to one of these band camp competitions, and they were blowing the high schoolers away because they could put the sheet music up, they could count it off 1, 2, 3, and they could play, and that ability was absolutely revolutionary, and that was installed into the music system, into the city's music system, in large part because in the latter part of the 19th century, the only people who were playing music were the wealthy. Those are the only people who could do it because they could afford it. Right? There was a piano in their home. Mom and daddy could hire a music teacher, and the city was so engaged and enthralled in music, but the only people who could play was a relatively small group, or they had to import people. So this happens, and that's when the city's music scene explodes, because generations of people like Jeanelle can count it off, quarter note, half note,
Still.
You're still
right.
doing it.
But thinking about your book and what you write, though, I want to talk more and ask you about this sound of Minneapolis, because we talked a little bit earlier, and I was processing and saying, I don't know, like, I know people call Prince the Minneapolis Sound, but I think it's just because he, like, became the biggest, like, pop cultural star from
Yeah.
Minneapolis, but he's a minority sound.
Yeah.
Right. The majority sound is quarter, half note.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and because there's so much white culture that influence music, classical music. I mean, you go to Orchestra Hall, you would be shocked to find people of color in Orchestra Hall.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so, and there's a lot of music in Minneapolis, but it's not necessarily representative of us.
Absolutely.
And so,
Absolutely.
like when you are speaking about the Minneapolis Sound and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, like, why do you consider someone who is a minority voice, musically, to be the anchoring of the sound of an entire city?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. The reason that Prince and Jimmy and Terry and Morris and all of those folks who come out of the South Side and the North Side in the early 70s to the early 80s, the reason they anchor it is because they are the synthesis of 150 years of sound. I'm, sort of philosophically, I really lean into this German philosopher named Hegel and a whole lot of people who came after him. And for me, that synthesis, represents something unique and innovative and brilliant and new that is produced from what has come after. And the Minneapolis Sound, in what Jimmy and Terry and all of them do, they mark a new sonic place built upon legacies of things that came before them, right? So, without what, for me, the Minneapolis Sound starts with English and the clap of gunfire. That's the beginning of the Minneapolis Sound, right? And that mobilizes itself into various kinds of folk music that the Germans are bringing in, and the Scandinavians are bringing in. It manifests itself in terms of the gospel sounds that black people are bringing in, right? And then you have, Giddings, who is, bringing this kind of, Eurocentric way of teaching music in, the emergence of jazz, all of that. But what they do is they have the ability to sort of look back sonically and recognize that there's something really great about how jazz is really built around improvisation, but at its core is the blues and a certain kind of system that the blues is built on, right? They can hear it, they can see it, so they bring that, right? But there's also this new thing called funk that's emerging, right? And they're all into funk, and they're trying to find ways to marry funk, right? And because because many of them don't have money for brass instruments, they swap out, what James Brown would have the band, playing these these brassy riffs. They swap that out for synthesizers, and so for these reasons, that ability to synthesize, to look back, to take what has existed, to take what has been in the past, and to create something entirely new from it, and to turn that new thing into a flexible, open system of music making. That really is when the Minneapolis Sound gets its mark of distinction. It's from what they did, right? But they are also part of this tradition of all of these other people, these German composers and these, Scandinavian folk singers and, these, white jazz cats doing jazz standards downtown. They're part of the indie rock tradition and the punk tradition. They're all part of it, right? But it's what they do that really transforms everything. And that's why the Minneapolis Sound is really, one could say it's 225 years old because it really begins with this moment of white settlement. And it finds its its culmination, its sort of high point in that 1987 album for me, because that's, and what he also does in that 1987 album is there's a synthesis of all this music, but it centers blackness. It really centers blackness, and it says something that, you know, Fanon and so many other people have said about blackness, is that part of the condition of living as a black person in the United States and the Western world is this ability to constantly have to negotiate and be flexible and open, right? If blackness does not bend, it will break. If anything doesn't bend, it will break. And the Minneapolis Sound is a deep and profound reflection of that. And no one would think something like that would come from Minneapolis.
So let's talk about this correlation between sound and survival.
Yeah.
Because even when you like write about the colonizers coming, and I'm reading your stories of how, you know, music was integrated into war time, into meal time,
Yeah.
into every part of their life. And the first thing that popped into my head was, well, of course, because when you are in a foreign land, in a foreign space, some of the things that you look for are the things that trigger your senses to remind you of home. Right?
That's right.
Otherwise, you're not going to survive.
That's right.
You look for the sights, the smells, the sounds, the things that make you feel like a little bit of home is with you.
That's right.
So even as the colonizers were bringing in their music, my mind said, well, of course, because
That's right.
because they need a piece of home
That's
in order
right.
to survive. And then fast forward, when you're looking at this context of the Black experience, we're coming out of the Civil Rights Movement.
Mm-hmm.
Motown had been a huge part of the sound of the Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. It was making a shift into ballads, and a lot of
That's right.
a lot of the Motown
Tears
singers
of a
were like, "Yeah,
Clown."
no, we can't, we can't do all these ballads." And
Yeah.
the younger generation, they needed something to dance to, right? And in Black cultural tradition over generations,
Mm-hmm.
dance is a huge way of releasing energy
That's right.
and stress and
right.
all the things of oppression that are come on you. You dance it out.
That's right.
And so you have this younger generation who's emerging out of the Civil Rights Movement who need music to dance to.
Yeah.
And like you have this funk
Yeah, that's right.
that has been gifted to them from James Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And in Minnesota in particular, because I think I'm the only one in the room who could say that I'm a Black person who was raised in Minnesota.
Yeah.
It is hard.
I know, yeah.
It is hard because people don't even believe we exist. Like everywhere I went, they would say, "Oh, there's Black people in Minnesota." No one
Right.
thinks that there are Black people in Minnesota, and the culture of Blackness in Minnesota is different from any other form of Blackness that you will experience in this country, because how our Blackness is shaped is rooted in survival within a white structure and society. Like there is no enclave of Black folks that you can go to and let your hair down and say we're safe.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever you go, there are always white people.
Everywhere.
It's not a Detroit. It's not a New Orleans. It's not even LA. I was telling someone, LA county has 10 million people, and 9% of that is Black folks. That's 900,000 Black people. Minneapolis has 420,000 people total. So LA has twice as many Black people as Minneapolis has people.
Yeah.
And so when you are growing up Black in Minnesota, you're trying to figure out, how do I survive? How do I be Black in a context? The schools are white, the education is white, you walk down the street, the grocery stores are white, everything is white. White culture is everywhere, and you're trying to place your identity. And so the music, in so many ways, is a survival kind of music. And the way that Prince takes it to be willing to even integrate white culture, to be able to say, don't pin me down to say that I am just Black, because he recognizes that being Black in Minnesota means that you're constantly in relationship with whiteness.
Absolutely.
So with that, like, what are your thoughts on the relationship of sound and survival in Minneapolis?
Sound was and remains a way for Black people in particular to navigate the apartheid system, the lack of resources that emanate from that, and it really is a form of physical mobilization, right? Prince's ability and all those cats' ability to play what they played gave them physical mobility. It allowed them to move around the city in different ways, go from north to south, various different places in the South, and they are the ones who broke the downtown apartheid scene. Because, you know, so in downtown Minneapolis, Black artists couldn't play. Black artists could not play in downtown Minneapolis for generations. And Prince and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis and all of those cats, they broke that apartheid system in the same way that, you know, Prince and Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston broke MTV's apartheid system. So sound really functions as a kind of as a form of resistance, as a form of mobilization. It also illuminates structures of opposition, because the very fact that Prince and all of these people are organizing their sonic realities in the way that they are, those sonic realities are all speaking to the way in which sound is manifesting in those neighborhoods, right? Black sound sounded like this, you know, white sound sounded like this, and it was all located in various different places, right? And so it shouldn't be a surprise that it was Black artists who did that synthesizing. That shouldn't be a surprise, because whether we're talking about, you know, King in the 60s, or whether we're talking about, you know, Fanon in the 50s writing Black Skin, White Mass, or even, you know, Black feminists in the 70s, you know, talking about intersectionality, that we shouldn't be surprised that people from the city's Black neighborhood reorganized the city's sound, because what they had to recognize was that the city's sound is different, and the city's sound is different because of where people are located. And I know if this is being played, if this is the harmonic structure, if these are the notes, if these are the rhythms, yeah, that's uptown. You know, if this is what's being played, oh, I know that's north side. If this is what's being played, I know that's downside. And they had to be geographically attuned, because they also had to be attuned to the city's racial dynamics as Black people living in the city. They couldn't just not know it, right? It was just part of the fact of Blackness in the city. And so, you know, for me, sound and survival and negotiation are always in operation, whether we're talking about Minneapolis or Chicago, or even Phoenix. You know, they're always working together.
Okay, so I have another question for you, because I studied theology, guys, and I read your book, and I'm like, why is Rashad not talking about religion and spirituality and its intersectionality with colonization and the sounds of spirituality and religion participating in that colonization, and then also how the sounds of spirituality influence Prince as well, because he's a deeply religious man.
Deeply religious.
So why did you not integrate that in your book?
Yes. Okay. A couple of reasons. One is it would have made the book so much longer, and it's already really long. It's like 320 pages already, and I was like, oh, I don't know. So that's one. It was, you know, length. Two, I really, and I was telling you this earlier, I really tried my best to stay away from the personal. I really tried my best. And here's why. Everything that's written about Prince is about who he slept with, who he dated, who he yelled at. You know, there's so much about the persona, the enigma, And the only thing Prince was transparent about is his music. That was it. Everything else is a mystery. Even though I wrote this book and read so much and talked to people, I don't know anything about that man. I really don't. But I can tell you about his music. I can tell you about his music all day long. So I really was nervous about, I talk about his religious traditions, but I did not want to tread into his personal life in that way. And I feared opening the door too much would cause people such as yourself to say, well, why not more? And then opening a little is like, why not more? And opening it not at all is like, well, why didn't you say something? And I agree with all of them. And yeah, it was a strategic, maybe not so good choice to do that. And to your point earlier, so we were talking about this earlier, I don't talk about his clear trauma. I steer clear of it. I mention, the abuse at home and all that, but I stay away from it, in large part because I don't know what else I would add to it. So that's my very not good answer to your really good question.
Well, because I feel like what you do in your book is you do a phenomenal job of showing the context and the historical context around Prince's sound. But then at what point does Prince also get to say, but my life influenced my sound too, right? Yes, I am from this tradition, and I've got daddy issues, and I've got mama issues, and like I'm an introvert, and so I live far away in Minneapolis where no one can find me, or in Chanhassen where nobody can find me, but I can create music because I can have the clarity of mind. Or the fact, like in his autobiography, he talks about the fact that he had epilepsy as a child, and then he had like a visitation from an angel and said that you're not gonna have epilepsy anymore, and like what, and then it was gone, and like, and what does that do to a musical genius, right? And but maybe you're right. There's no answers to those questions, so you can't really like factually like pin it down and write about it. But is there room for folks to engage Prince the person as it relates to his sound too?
So what I'm really hoping, when I was finishing the book and rewriting it and all of that, I was saying, here are some of the holes in it. Here are some of the areas where it's not as strong. And what I am thinking, what I'm hoping now is that this book creates an opening for a different kind of engagement with him, right? And I really hope that this is not the end all be all. This is a modest attempt to situate him and the city and illustrate that he is a native son of the city's black community and the way in which that black community was constituted and constructed fed into his sound, right?
Is that an invitation for a PhD student to come?
That's right. And it is an invitation for people to come in and fill in the significant gaps in this book. And also, the book is a bit of a ruse, and I have to just keep track of the time. So
because I won't. I'm time blind.
So
we'll be here all night.
We're done at 4, so we should probably open it up. But the book is a bit of a ruse. The book is really not about Prince. The book is about the city's sound. And I really am trying to lure people in with diamonds and pearls. I want to lure people in with diamonds and pearls, because I want them to read about the city's history. I want them to understand this amazing place. Jimmy Jam said, Minneapolis is far out of touch with the rest of the country. And it is, in precisely the way you said it in terms of race, in all of these other kinds of ways. But it is only because of that, one, you can get this kind of sound. And of course, the revolution that would, the spark that would spark a global revolution comes out of that place. Of course it wouldn't be Chicago. Of course it wouldn't be Nashville, Tennessee. Of course it wouldn't be LA. It would be Minneapolis, right? Because of it's so unique, it's so particular, and it is not thought of as the site of blackness. It is not thought of as a site of radical politics. But as I saw this meme, in the months after George Floyd was murdered, Prince always knew the revolution would come out of there, with him standing with the revolution, right? And even though it made me chuckle, it also seemed very true. It also seemed very true that of course, the spark that would start a global revolution and a global protest movement would come out of Minneapolis, because Minneapolis is special. So this is also a little bit of my, love letter to that city and those folks.
Thank you.
Okay, you're good. You guys can share that one to answer. So I'm also going to look online, but we have some Q&A questions. I did have a question, so I'm going to ask mine first.
All right.
So I know you guys kind of touched on it at the end, but basically I was thinking, and this does get a little bit into the personal, so apologies there, but despite some of his homophobic commentary later in life, it's undeniable that Prince is a queer icon, the way he dresses, the way he acts, the lyrics of his songs, and where am I in this question? Oh yeah, so how does Minneapolis's 20th century queer scene, gay scene, how has that shaped his upbringing and thus his music? Are there clear connections? You speak a lot about Black community and immigrant communities, but how does that relate to the queer community at the time?
Yeah, so Prince was, so when he broke up the revolution, Prince had been writing music with Wendy and Lisa for that 6 years that they were together, and he broke it up because he wanted to take his sound in a very different direction. And Prince could be an asshole. That's just there's no other way to put it. He could be a real asshole. And he was not a Marxist when it came to pay, because he did not pay his people well. And I say that over and over. Jimmy, Terry, Morris, and even the members of the revolution, he did not equitably pay them. He stiffed them. So that needs to be said. And I think homophobia became a way for Prince to level vitriol toward Wendy and Lisa. It became an avenue for, even, despite the fact that he gave them all of this power and wrote music with them, he drew on homophobia as a way to level vitriol against them and to sort of shift the blame of their departure on them when it was him. It was he fired them. He said, I want to go in a different direction. But then he went on to say, what Wendy and Lisa are doing, and that was just nonsense. That said, and this is something I wanted to write about, that Minneapolis had this sort of really interesting queer community. For one, LGBT folks were entering into the public scene in terms of the political scene in the 70s. And so as Harvey Milk is being murdered, people, LGBTQ folks are entering the scene in Minneapolis. Plus, there was this kind of outness about the city's gay community, and for me, it plays a role, if not only in terms of how Prince performed his masculinity that was profoundly gender fluid, but also sonically to the degree that disco plays a huge role in his 70s and early 80s music, and disco is coming out of Black queer communities, right? And everybody sort of knows that, and he knew that. And he would be in those clubs where that music was being played. So for me, it is part of his gender performance, but it is also equally part of his sonic, the sound of his music.
Yeah.
One specifying question about that. Just in terms
Okay.
of the milieu that Prince was in, where is the sort of
Did you want to use
the most visible gay community or queer community in Minneapolis? Is that related to where Prince was, or?
Where is the most? I would say up. Like in that time in the 70s, it's still uptown. Still, it's still uptown.
It's mostly uptown, right?
Yeah, it's always been uptown.
Where he's playing.
He's
Right.
playing
Or
uptown.
yeah, one of the places which he's playing, because he moves around where he plays. I think it's also really important to understand about Prince is that when he was a young kid, he saw his father as he looked up to his father as a musician, and he adored his mother. And his parents, being two artists in their own rights, they would and could dress to the nines. Like he talks about his father outdoing his mother in all of his suits and outfits. So fashion was just a part of his family. It's a part of his genes. It's part of his DNA, right? And so when he's coming into the scene and he appreciates women, he loves women. He surrounds himself with women all of his life. In some ways, he almost prefers women to men. He feels safer with women. And so I just think that, I mean, as a female, I've always had like male friends growing up who just felt safer and more comfortable in a group of girls than they did with other men. And I think Prince was like that, and so his identity, and he had a little sister as well. So when you have a sister, like you're moving through life differently, and so I think he was just okay with blending masculinity and femininity without drawing any lines, and
even like the symbol?
but he was also very strict with his faith as well. And his faith and his religion mattered to him. And so how he was trying to work that out, like he saw religion as a tool to try to figure out how to be a better person. And so what that meant for him and how he was working it out, that's just like any other human being trying to figure out, what is my spirituality and what do I believe and why do I believe it? And some would say, like, I know some Christians would look at Prince and be like, "Oh, he ain't saved," like, not with what he's wearing. And so it's interesting, right? So you have this character of a person who is so artistic that he is so comfortable, literally in his bare skin, like, and it doesn't bother him.
Booty cheeks hanging out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he would also come to say later in life, I wish I had learned about sex from my father sitting me down and talking, reading the Song of Solomon to me and explaining it in a very, it's explaining it in a way that didn't involve like magazines and rated R films. Yeah, right. And so yeah, he's a very complicated person into that matter. So would he say that he was trying to be an icon for LGBTQ community and queer folks?
But he was also deeply implicated in those communities. He was,
Right.
He was also he was playing in Uptown, black, white, Puerto Rican, everybody just a freaking on the Uptown song. Yes, HQ, I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I just want to comment on that, but I do have a question. I think some of Prince's earliest audience were the LGBTQ community, so I think it's important to say that.
Yeah.
That his music was at the time where there was segregation on the airwave as well.
That's right.
And some white radio station will play Michael Jackson, but will not play Prince. And
That's
that's
right.
the distinction, because Prince is black music.
That's right.
I think that's really important. And so, not unlike Madonna in some way, some of the earliest and strongest and most vocal supporter of Prince were the queers.
That's right.
Let's face it. Also, he came of musical age during a time where funk was like supreme.
Yeah,
And so we're talking about Sylvester.
that's right.
I mean, now this is a serious, iconic queer icon, and everybody was imitating.
That's right.
You know, I mean, even so. And then of course there's Betty Davis,
That's right.
Miles Davis' ex-wife, not the actress. Okay, so and you know, I mean, and these people were quintessentially serious people,
Yeah.
right? They were smart, they were fly,
Yeah.
and they were musically brilliant.
Yeah.
And Prince, I think, idolized those people.
Absolutely.
So there's that. But my question is, first of all, I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
I think it's brilliant, what I heard and what I've seen.
Thank you.
Can you talk about 21st century sound, Minneapolis Sound?
yeah,
Because
yeah.
that sound somehow help us and, like you said, give us part of this revolution
Yeah.
that we're still experiencing, actually. But I want more context.
Yeah.
Who should we be listening to? What should we
Yeah.
be paying attention to?
Yeah. Let me just say thank you so much for those really kind words. The 21st century sound is in a bit of a crisis, and the reason it's in a crisis is because public support for music education has dwindled across the country. It has dwindled across the country, and this has provided a profound disservice to the arts. What Giddings did in Minneapolis had intergenerational impact. It gave generations of young people a language to speak, and that has been systematically torn away from kids, and it has been removed from the public. We have basically gone back to what Minneapolis was in the latter part of the 19th century, the whole nation, which is privately funded music education. And if you got the money, if you have someone who has music education in your family, if you have the time and resources, you can have it. If you don't, there are other technologies to facilitate that. I'm in support of musical technologies that make up the gap, but I don't think that is a solution. And I think the further we go down that road, the worse it will be. And we need to bring music education back into our public education system. Young people need to understand what a quarter note is, what a half note is. They need to understand how to play an instrument and hold a pitch. Like we need to do that, not only so we can create, generations of great musicians, but this is a language, this is a way for people to speak to each other who have all different kinds of divisions between them around gender and class and race and sexuality, and to be able to sit with another musician and say, all right, what you gonna riff on? Oh, and she was like, oh, I'm just gonna play a few chords in G minor. I was like, okay, let me jump in, and I can do, and having a practice to do that, right? This is what Scott Brooks talks about in terms of what makes sports so important, right? Because it creates these kind of pathways, and ripping this out of schools has been is a profound form of undermining our democracy and our ability to create pathways and transgress. In terms of who we should listen to, I really love Moses Sumney right now. I keep going back to Radiohead because I just can't get enough of Radiohead. But in terms of young folks, I really like Polo G, who's a Chicago MC. And who else am I listening to? Okay, hold on one second. Let me. I just want to pull, because I got this one person that I'm listening to right now, and I'm just forgetting her name. What's that? I'm taking notes. Yes. Oh man, Hooray for the Riff Raff is an incredible band. Really, really incredible band. there's a lot of really amazing music out. It's a ton. At the same time, I'm worried. I'm worried because as the technological advances to fill the gap in music education become more and more sophisticated, I'm worried that it will remove the need for people to say, well, you know, why should we even worry about teaching someone how to play the oboe or the whatever? Because we can just, you know, create a technological response. So while I think there's a lot of great music out, I'm also concerned.
So I think the sound now is going to evolve because we are in a perpetual state of protest. I was just at a protest on Monday where the kids were marching for DEI because they're trying to rip it out of the classroom, right? And so we have this generation of young people who are more so concerned about the totality of their education. And so in protest and march always comes music. Like there's something about rhythm and sounds that help people remember the call and response. And so much of the sound is deeply marbled in the ongoing protests that are existing, whether they be union protests, whether they be Black Lives Matter protests, whether they be school protests. Like every other day, there's some kind of protest marching down the street. I will also say, so I did my grad school in Los Angeles, and when I moved out there, I saw like every Minnesotan out there. Like Minnesotans, like they are all in Los Angeles. But it also told me something. Like Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis, they moved out to LA. Lizzo moved out to LA. One of the things that happens is people migrate to Los Angeles to try to make it. What Prince did not do is that. Prince stayed in Minnesota and continued to nurture his sound in Minnesota because I think he also realized that being connected to the ground and the earth from that gave him his sound, he was able to continue to create and evolve his own sound. This kind of constant migration for the industry to make it big is compromising sound. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we're constantly facing is just people thinking, I have to move to LA to create, as opposed to believing in their own creativity and their own sound and say, I can be at home. It's like, it's music drain. So they talk about brain drain. Like LA is creating music drain for every state and city in this country. Like there are so many homeless people in Los Angeles, and a lot of them are people who attempt to go out to LA, make it, don't make it, have shame, and can't figure out how do I go back home and tell my families. And so they would rather stay and try to figure out life and struggle than to return home unsuccessful. And it's hard, it's tragic. That we have this musical industry that is doing that to people, or not just music, but acting and all of the movie industry, everything that happens in Los Angeles. So I think part of our challenge is to think about not just for Minneapolis, but for everybody's hometown. Like, what does it look like to nurture our sounds in our own communities and breathe life and breath and hope and opportunity that people can actually create right where they are and give back right where they are.
Hi. So lots of wonderful discussion on the correlation Minnesota and sound. And I wondered what you were able to discover with regard to correlation to lyrics.
So this is the thing. Yeah. Okay, so when I first started this, I was like, oh, I'm going to look at the lyrics. And then I started looking through the lyrics, and I was like, man, he don't talk about Minneapolis at all. I'm going to pack this in. So what I did was, so I'm a frustrated bad musician. I play the guitar, and I've been taking lessons for the piano. I'm bad, but I can talk about it good enough and create enough rhythm. What I discovered was that the Minneapolis Sound was not lyrical. There aren't many there's a few references, like Uptown, that song, that famous song, is absolutely referenced. There are a few other songs like that too, but the vast majority is not. The way the sound is communicated is through instrumentation. So I had to learn some basic music theory, just basic, like rhythm and harmony and chord progressions and scales and musical alphabet, just so that I could talk about it. And that was a lot of fun. It took years to do. But I do talk about the lyrics, and in terms of Prince's lyrics, they are, funny and catchy. They can be profoundly subversive, and they can also be bizarre. But one of the things that overall I could say about Prince's lyrics is that Prince sort of approaches his lyrics kind of like Taylor Swift does. It's much more of a poetics, and it's a kind of poetry put to music. Prince actually, he writes the music. He composes it, he'll just compose the music, and because he can't write, he has to run off and record it. So that's why he stayed in the studio all the time. So he'd be walking down, as the story, he was walking in the hallway, he got on 4-inch heels, and the heels hit the linoleum in a certain kind of way and made a sound, and he darted off. People were like, where the hell did he go? He just darted off, and he went into the studio, and he laid down the drum track from what he heard in his head, and he built the song around it immediately. And then what he would do is he would sort of layer the lyrics in this kind of poetic way over it. And I think there's this connection between, Taylor Swift and him, that they both have this kind of poetics in their lyrics. His is also inflected by gospel and funk and these other music traditions that hers aren't necessarily, but so that's the connection I see. Hell no. He would give me the princiest shade in the world. He would give me the princey. He would just, I could just see him looking at me. But yeah, no, he would not. Oh yeah, mad shade. Yeah. No, Prince could be. He was the shadiest of the shady. He couldn't get.
So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, Craig, then Miramar. Okay.
I'll pass the mic.
Yeah.
So, I guess I want to ask about the future orientation and its relation to place and Prince in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Sound.
Yeah.
Seems to me Prince's music has a pretty big orientation to the futures. I mean, not only is it embracing new musical trends, new kinds of instrumentation, synth and all of that, and occasionally lyrically about the future, but it's oriented to kind of future community, and he articulates a certainty of the future community. This seems to me to be a long part of the black musical tradition, the black tradition in general. Yeah. So you see it in Ralph Ellison talking about the community that will transcend it, Invisible Man.
Sun Ra.
Right, and you see it all the way back, right? Yeah. So that there's for the enslaved, and the music they brought with them from Africa, but there's a new tradition that is oriented to the future, and a future that will be better than the predicament we're in now. Absolutely. So I want to ask about that, because that seems to me potentially also a different relation to Minneapolis. Yeah. It's right, I'm not just sheltering here and saying I embody the essence of Minneapolis as it is in relation to some other national music scene. Yeah. I'm here marshaling my creative forces to create a future that transcends Minneapolis as it is and that natural scene. Am I?
No, you're not. I mean, so lyrically and sonically, Prince's music was always thinking about these sort of possible futures, these imagined places, right? He does this in the song Paisley Park, which came out before Paisley Park was built, and he's talking about this sort of, laboratory of joy and of community. He also does it to a certain degree in Uptown, where he's saying Uptown is a sort of moniker for radical possibility and radical democracy. Black, white, Puerto Rican, just a freakin', everybody just a freakin', how gender and sexuality become fluid in that place, and how that place is enabling for something really interesting and somewhat even utopic. But, going back to Jeanelle's point, staying in Minneapolis and investing in Minneapolis and creating that mega complex in Minneapolis really allowed him, as this kind of genius and auteur, to continue to do this work. But it was also a way to give the city what the city never had, which was a high quality production space, while also continuing to foster the evolution of the city sound by being involved, right? So the night Prince died, he was at the Dakota Jazz Club, which is this fantastic jazz club in downtown Minneapolis, seeing a performance, right? He was always involved. He kept his ear to the street. He was actively participating, and he wanted to do whatever he could do to support the city sound, whether that was his presence, whether it was through mentorship. One of those people being Lizzo. Even though she's not from Minneapolis, she went there to get discovered in a lot of ways, or by offering his space for recording and production. So Prince wanted to ensure that the Minneapolis sound continued to evolve, and what he left was not only a barrage of music, some 15, 20,000 songs, but he also left infrastructure. He really left infrastructure, and I think how forward-thinking, for someone who could be a bit selfish, who could be a bit of an asshole. He also left infrastructure for generations, and in many ways, he's sort of carrying on the legacy of Giddings, who gave thousands of young people the tools to play music, and now he's giving generations a place to record, to perform, and to continue to evolve the city sound. Now he just needs to create a bus system from the city, because it's like 25 miles away, but there is that. But thank you. Mary Margaret.
Okay. This is a question about pleasure. Maybe 15 years ago, I went to remember when La Palooza was a big thing, music festivals? I went to a funk version of that in Phoenix, in that theater with the
Celebrity Theater.
Celebrity Theater with the circle. Okay, so packed house, extremely multiracial, maybe 3 women for every man. Everybody was on their feet. It was all the famous funk groups, even though it's past their heyday. They brought the big horns. It wasn't, So everybody is on their feet. They might have been like 40 and older, but they were like, and a man, like the row in front of me was like a woman and maybe 3 girlfriends, and somebody had a boyfriend, and he'd have them all, his arms around all of them, and we were singing and dancing in the aisles, and I mean, it was just really a joyful pleasure experience that the funk music brought out. And so it kind of reminds me of that part of Prince that spoke to that. But these were definitely, it was a working class crowd. And there was more than like, it was survival, but it was also like just the pleasure and the joy that came from the sexuality, the pleasure, the eroticism that music spoke to. And then of course, it got too expensive to travel with big bands like that, and becomes more electronic, but that was my Prince. And then, was he a Jehovah's Witness?
Prince became a Jehovah's Witness.
There's a fair number of very prominent black creatives who've been Jehovah's Witnesses. And I heard Donald Glover talk about not being exposed to pop culture created a certain imagination of space. And Jackie Woodson, Zadie Smith, I mean, all these really top black artists and creatives have that particular.
Prince became a Jehovah's Witness later, but he grew up Seventh-day Adventist. So he grew up Seventh-day Adventist, so he had this really, kind of strict religious, tradition. And part of the reason that Prince ended up homeless is because he was bringing girls into the house and his father kicked him out. And part of it was disobeying his father, but there was also a kind of religious transgression that he had been participating in. And so he sort of transgresses that, leaves, does everything that he does, and then he comes back to be this really deep, engaged Jehovah's Witness. Prince was showing up at people's houses on Sunday. He was like that, Bible in hand, knocking on the door, saying, "Have you heard the good word?" And if you can imagine, open up the door and Prince is standing there, I mean, that's the Jehovah's Witness I want to talk to. No shade to the Jehovah's Witness, but I'd be like, "Oh, come on in, man. Come on in. I want to hear the good word. I want to hear all the words," He kind of stayed close to it toward the end of his life, but I think, he
No, he did, because he didn't move away from it. Because if you go to Paisley, he didn't move away from it because if you go to Paisley Park now, they're extremely strict that you have to. Everything that we do in Paisley Park is in alignment with Prince's religious values. So we, when we did an event there last year, they were like, all right, Prince was this, that, and that, the other, so you have to abide by those rules. And so, so I think in many ways it was, his faith and spirituality to me mimicked that of Michael Jackson, where the public put so much pressure on them, like how they practice their own faith and spirituality. They figure it out in a deeply personal way, but they just don't always make that part of themselves public. You have a mic already.
It's 4:00. This concludes the Twin Flame speaker series. If you have not seen the exhibit, please go upstairs and see it. And before we do that, please join me in thanking Rashad Shabazz and Jeanelle Austin. Thank you for joining us today. Be well.